param radhavadana sakoram lalidasodaram param pavana guru pavana puradesha mashaye guru pavana puradesha mashaye.
I'm Kenneth Valpey, a research fellow of the Oxford Center for Hindu Studies. I've come to Chennai to explore the living tradition of the Bhagavata Purana, an ancient text of India. So we're going to be exploring, we're going to be meeting people, finding out more about this tradition which I've been studying for the last 40 years. This is a good place to begin these explorations because it is indeed a living tradition of spirituality, of yoga, especially of bhakti yoga. Here we are to enter into the world of the Bhagavata, the Bhagavata Purana.
But that's the miracle of the Bhagavata. It's an endless wellspring of inspiration in scholarship as well as it has been so for the Hindu tradition.
So here we are to explore so many different facets of this text. It is a recognized text of the Hindu tradition. It tells many narratives about Krishna, identifying him as the supreme person. It gives direction how we can elevate ourselves to a position of recognizing our true spiritual nature. It has wonderful, wonderful narratives, philosophy, and reflection on the nature of the self, the nature of ultimate reality.
Bhakti throughout the centuries, and in the Bhagavata particularly, has been expressed through multiple ways, through service to the divine, through service to other human beings, through dance and music and drama, culture and literature. All of these become expressions of bhakti. So it's a combination of the idea of devotion as a state of feeling and service as an activity.
Our center in Oxford has organized an academic conference here in Chennai where many scholars will be discussing from all different angles this amazing text. My own quest is to get a better sense of why is it that this text, the Bhagavata Purana, is popular for scholars but for all kinds of people after so many centuries. It was brought together at least 1,000 years ago. The tradition says 5,000 years ago. What is it about this text that makes it so interesting to study and also to live for so many people, not just in India, but more and more all over the world? Well, here we are at the University of Madras. This university is one of the oldest and most venerable institutions of learning in India. It has a Sanskrit manuscript library, one of the largest in the country. It's very appropriate that we have the beginning of our conference here. So let's go and see what happens.
The text consists of 12 books or skandhas, of which the 10th book, with about 4,000 verses, is the most popular and is probably the basis of a lot of modern Hinduism. It is the source of Indian art and culture, the dances, the music, the theatre, the street plays that we see everywhere. Bhagavata Purana has become part of our festivals, the Holi, Diwali, everything. They were all inspired. They continue to be inspired by the stories of the Bhagavata Purana. Paintings from all over the country. And of course the wonderful Krishna Leela, which is expressed in so many ways in different art forms. It is important in Indian religious literature for its emphasis on the practice of bhakti or devotion. While the Bhagavata is primarily a bhakti text, emphasizing that moksha or liberation may be achieved through a personal relationship with Krishna, the philosophy and teachings include several traditions and an absence of narrow sectarianism.
What is it that's so special about the Bhagavata that makes it interesting for people today?
The Bhagavata has earned the general characteristic of a classic. And a classic always withstands the test of time. And even today, it seems to attract readers. And I think part of the reason for that is it is an extremely variegated text. It is literarily speaking, it's very rich, it's very beautiful. And theologically, it's very, very deep. And for the West, it's sort of a refreshing book. It's a new angle on things. Especially as the world has grown smaller and smaller, we're more aware of other cultures, other viewpoints, other perspectives. And the Bhagavata offers an extraordinarily rich perspective.
You have especially focused on one particular portion of the Bhagavata, known as the Rasa Leela, the dance, Krishna's divine dance. Now, you mentioned that this dance is understood to be going on without end, suggesting that as we speak, it is taking place. Is that the understanding?
You can't see it right now? It is taking place. Now, to the tradition, it is something that is eternal. And this eternality is represented, as you spoke of earlier, by mandala. A circle is known in so many cultures as the great symbol of eternality. Because there's no beginning. You can't point to any beginning of the circle or any end. And this, for the Chaitanya school, is the great symbol of entering the dance of divine love with God. That here, in the final, ends of all things, the soul is released into a divine dance of love. It's an extremely positive, joyous occasion. And Krishna, as the deity, he is known as supremely beautiful, supremely playful, and supremely delightful.
The Rasa festival commenced, graced by the circle of gopis with the master of yoga, Krishna, positioned between each two of them. Embraced by him around their necks, each girl was thinking he is with her alone. At that time, the sky was filled with hundreds of celestial airships of the gods and their wives, their minds caught up with the excitement to witness the dance. Then kettle drums resounded, showers of flowers descended, and the chief Gandharvas with their wives sang Krishna's flawless glory. As Krishna's consorts sang his praises, by their dancing steps, gesturing hands, sportive eyebrows and smiles, swaying waists, tightened braids and belts, shifting blouses, ear ornaments, and swinging against their cheeks, and faces perspiring, they shone like streaks of lightning amidst a circle of clouds. the two persons of the Bhagavata, the king Parikshit and the sage Shuka, are speaking throughout the text. In what way does the Bhagavata encourage the reader or the listener to identify with the king who we understand is about to die?
Yes, it is a fascinating story. So this is a text that deals with, ultimate things, and the ultimate event of everyone's life is death. So here's a king who in some sense sits in for the rest of us. And the big question, of course, is what does one do to prepare for death? How should one prepare for death? But what's interesting to me about the Bhagavata is that as you read along, you get so absorbed in these kinds of other realms. There's these alaukika realms, otherworldly realms, that in one sense, you've already been taken beyond death. And by the time you get to the Ras Leela, you've already walked through that door of death, and death, in some sense, has been dismantled. Death is just merely a doorway, so the self can contain so much of the love and affection for divinity.
And at the end of the text, we understand the king doesn't actually die.
Right.
Can you explain that?
Well, again, theologically, death means it doesn't mean that you die. Death means you enter a different state. At least this is the Bhagavata's understanding, that the soul is eternal, the self is eternal, and it can be liberated into eternal, the most beautiful, playful, and delightful realms. And this is, I think, the very attractive aspect of the Bhagavata.
So would you say this is where we get the sense of the Bhagavata's presentation of yoga?
Yes. Yoga really is about the uniting of the true self with a perfect realm.
Krishna is growing up. First, he's a little child who is charming the residents of Vrindavan or Vraja. He meets with so many of his friends as cowherd boys. He tends the calves and the cows. And he also encounters many asuras, or demons, magical beings who have been sent by the evil King Kamsa to kill Krishna. Krishna grows up. He eventually goes from Vrindavan to a place called Mathura, and there he meets with this king who wants to kill him. And there he, Krishna, kills Kamsa. Later on, he goes on to create his own city, Dwaraka, in the western part of what we now call India. Of all beings, the supreme being, the supreme person, is the source of all fame, of all knowledge, of all strength, of all beauty, and also of the renunciation of all of these opulences. So this is Krishna. described, celebrated, and very much made prominent in the Bhagavata Purana. Professor John Stratton Hawley is a professor of religion at Barnard College at Columbia University in New York. He's been teaching there since the last 30 years or more and researching on the Indian bhakti tradition. And he wrote a wonderful book some decades ago, dare I say, called Krishna the Butter Thief. What can we say about that motif as a way of representing divinity?
Well, in my own life story, you got it exactly right. I grew up as a Protestant, and so, it was a great relief to me to encounter a religious tradition that felt that religion was at least as much about play as it was about work. This was a big relief to me. So, the butter thief, it's just play, play, play. But the other thing that's going on there, and it's going on in a childhood moment, so that's an interesting facet all its own, is, what is this butter? Well, it's, it's milk, so it's the most concentrated, viscous, interestingly spreadable form of milk. But it's milk, and what is milk? Milk is the female substance, given only under conditions of love. You have a cow who is being milked. What can you do? You can bring an effigy of a calf, and the mother cow can be persuaded to give milk. So it's all about the sort of the givenness of the world, all the sort of wonderful milk that brings us to be who we are. And then we have the Lord in the position of being the thief of that milk. What is this supposed to mean? At the very least, it's very different from Protestant notions of the religious structure of the world that I grew up with.
Indeed.
Yeah. And the parallel motif in the Bhagavatam, at least as important, is where Krishna, as a little child, starts eating, as little children will do, starts eating mud. He starts eating the dust of the earth right in front of him. And we've all seen kids doing that. And what does the mother do? She says, stop, don't do it. You stay away from that stuff. And when she gets in his way, so to speak, he begins opening his mouth to her, so that she can see what he's actually eating. And you know how the story goes.
Yeah.
In that mouth, she sees the entire cosmos open before her eyes, coming out of the mouth of her child, and she gets quite frightened. And another motif asks him actually to close his mouth again. So
She sees herself.
And she sees herself, that's right.
Inside. Yes.
So what is happening in this whole drama of being involved with children? I'm not sure we know the answer, but we know that it's something cosmic.
Something cosmic. And it's some kind of turning of all relationships inside out, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yes. Could you say a little about, to change the subject slightly, Vaikuntha Perumal Temple?
That one could make sense of this very important 8th century temple in Kanchipuram, where I hear you're going tomorrow. Make sense of the temple of Vaikuntha Perumal if one understood the sequence of stories in the Bhagavata. And that this was a temple that tried to do two things. It documented, in a satisfying way, in this temple structure, it documented the religious history of the dynasty that it served.
Through bas relief.
Absolutely. Reliefs on the side of the temple itself. But at the same time, it achieved that purpose by telling the story of the Bhagavata at the same time.
Behind us is the Vaikuntha Perumal temple of Kanchipuram near Chennai. This temple is some 1,200 years old. This is a temple which is a treasure house of history. It has to do with a king, Nandivarman Pallavamala, who has established this temple of Vishnu and Krishna as a way of legitimizing his own rule in the Pallava dynasty. It is important also for establishing the age of the Bhagavata Purana, which is very much a matter of dispute among scholars. From this temple we can understand the text, the Bhagavata Purana, is at least 1,200 years old.
கோபுரம் தெரியுற மாதிரி எடுக்கணும். மாடியில நின்னு எடுத்துட்டேன். மாடி. அந்த பொண்ணு புடிங்க, அந்த பொண்ணு தான் புடிங்க.
Here we are in the background, Vaikuntha Perumal Temple. One of Vishnu's names is Vaikuntha, but also his abode is known as Vaikuntha, a place with no worry, no problems, and a place no one would really want to leave. I personally think that the Bhagavata's relevance comes from its very honest view of human nature. The Bhagavata recognizes human desire, human weakness as well. Some of the most compelling stories in the Bhagavata are ones where human beings seek the ultimate and yet stumble and then come back to have their success. What I like to call second chance narratives. They happen again and again. One of the most famous is the story of Ajamila, who begins life in a wonderfully pious way and then ends up stumbling with a moral lapse, and then comes back to become very focused and ultimately achieve the highest end. And again and again, the Bhagavata makes its message relevant to us mere mortals, to ordinary human beings who struggle with life's day-to-day challenges, rather than simply providing a lofty message for the likes of renunciates and sages, who frankly most of us aren't.
Right.
Yeah, the Vedic perspective is more that education and life is more like a spiral. Our German view is like one line, one direction, never come back. But this is more like discuss the sun comes up, the sun goes down. We meet people again and again, but each time higher, higher, higher. So this perspective of a spiral, I think, is more the view of life that the Bhagavatam is promoting. Every single psychological circumstance we can encounter is in Srimad Bhagavatam. And so if we develop this feeling for all these things, we go through life with this divine perspective in every situation like that. Some people, their perspective is that if you just get the right combination of things, I knew one fellow, he was a lawyer, his father had been married to his mother, and after that he'd been married to another woman and had a long relation with 2 more women. So he was totally shocked when he told him, well, Tom, I think I finally found the right girl. This idea of finding the right combination of things, which we would call karmi. And so someone says, no, you're never going to find the right combination of material things that will give you satisfaction. So that path is in the path of wisdom, or gyan, which without love or devotion or dedication or sacrifice also doesn't satisfy the self. So the Bhakti Marg is something, Marg path.
Yeah.
It's described all over the world by different people like that in the Christian tradition, Muslim tradition. So many ways people talk about this of giving yourself, sacrificing, and this being the satisfaction.
A major topic of the Bhagavata Purana is how to cultivate our intrinsic natural feeling of devotion. Devotion for the supreme source of our being. There's a term for this, it's bhakti. Bhakti is from a Sanskrit term which means to share. And the entire Bhagavata Purana is circling around this subject to help us understand how we can open up what the Bhagavata is trying to show is already potentially there within our heart, within our consciousness. So bhakti yoga is the technique, the practice, you can even say discipline, of cultivating our innate nature of devotion. And that devotion is, because it is innate, because it is natural, when it unfolds, when we learn, or rather when we remember what is already there in a dormant state, that brings about deep satisfaction. We're now at the C.P. Ramaswamy Iyer Foundation. Dr. Iyer was a very prominent intellectual statesman of South India, was a great lover of culture, of intellectual pursuits, and this foundation is carrying the legacy of his life, his activity, and his writings. So it's very appropriate that we're having this conference here. He certainly would have been very happy to host this conference, as his descendants are now doing. So we're going to begin the second day of our conference here. We'll have our second and third days of the 3-day conference here in this center.
The Bhagavata Purana is a genre of Hindu scriptural texts called the Purāṇa, of which there are several, 18 major ones and several minor ones. The Bhagavata is one of the most well-known today. It's a very lengthy text in the Sanskrit language with several hundreds, even thousands of verses. Well, the Bhagavata is an interesting confluence of a number of different trends and languages and traditions within the broad kind of religion of Hinduism. At the same time, the Bhagavata wasn't just a text, it was performed. It was always orally recited and rendered. The Bhagavata was translated into several Indian vernacular languages. But in addition to translation, many of the stories that are contained in the Bhagavata formed the cornerstone of various networks of devotional poetry, or what we call bhakti poetry, throughout the Indian subcontinent. So that centered largely around the life of Krishna. His mischievous pranks as a little boy, his loving kind of escapades as an adolescent, and even his sort of his grand stature as a philosophical exemplar, like that presented in the Bhagavad Gita. All of these identities of Krishna are encapsulated in the Bhagavata, and they are then sort of taken up for a great deal of, they become the object of interest for a number of different devotional groups, religious communities, spanning the Indian subcontinent and for the next few centuries after the text's own composition.
Are usually seen as distinct traditions, distinct theologies. Is it that the Bhagavatam is doing something not so clear-cut?
Well, the Bhagavata is generally seen as a primarily Vaishnava text, and for good reason. Vishnu is, in his incarnation as Krishna, is central to the Bhagavata's own theology. At the same time, the Bhagavata does seem to show a great deal of influence from early Shaiva religious traditions and texts. For example, some of what we see as distinct features of bhakti in the Bhagavata, that is to say, bhakti meaning emotional love for a visually entrancing God. Some of these very physical features of bhakti, such as hair standing on end, tears rolling down one's cheeks, eyes welling up with the sense of anticipation.
The symptoms of the experience of emotions in relation to the Lord.
Right, these symptoms of bhakti, or emotional love for God, which we consider distinct to the Bhagavata, feature in some early Shaiva texts when thinking about what a yogi, that is to say, an ascetic, mostly solitary meditator, experiences when he encounters his goal of absorption in the divine.
I know you're a historian, but moving to the present, could you say something about how the text has migrated beyond South Asia?
Well, the history of the migration of the Bhagavata to the West or to outside India, let's say, largely has to do with the major religious movement in the 20th century, begun by Swami Prabhupada. The story of the Bhagavata's migration outside of India is twofold, actually. Early European scholars of Indian religion and literature were very interested in the Bhagavata. It was one of the earliest Indian texts to actually be translated into European language. But that was largely at the scholarly level. At the more popular, let's say, religious or devotional level, the Bhagavata became central to many people's view of Hinduism in general, largely from the mid-20th century onwards, with the migration of several teachers from India to the West, including but not limited to Swami Prabhupada, who was the founder of the modern ISKCON movement.
What do we actually understand by the term liberation in general, but perhaps more specifically in the Bhagavata?
Classically speaking, the term liberation meant liberation from the finite bonds of everyday existence. This is a term that was very important to early Buddhism and Jainism, traditions that emphasized that the world was primarily, and life in the world was primarily comprised of suffering, from birth to old age to death, and that this was repeated over and over.
Samsara.
Samsara. This cycle and this endless cycle was seen as something extremely negative and something that one should strive to be free of. Hence the term liberation, to be free from this cycle of birth and death. In the Bhagavata, however, there is a more positive twist given to liberation, attaining unity with one's beloved, and God here is seen as one's beloved. The Bhagavata is very insistent that bhakti is the singular means to liberation, in fact, the most efficacious means to liberation. And so it does, at very significant places, hold liberation as an ideal. For example, there's the story of Ajamila, who was a sort of dissolute man who, at the very end of his life, simply calls out to his son, whose name, Narayana, is the same name as one of the names of Vishnu.
Right.
As a result, because he simply recites God's name at his death, he is given liberation. So that is seen as a very important and valued goal. But at the same time, the emphasis of the stories is on the power of bhakti itself, and why it contributes to a fulfilled human life.
नारायणं नमस्कृत्य नरं चैव नरोत्तमं नारायणं नमस्कृत्य नरं चैव नरोत्तमं देवीं सरस्वतीं व्यासं ततो जयमुदीरयेत् नमस्ते देवदेवेश चङ्गचक्रगदाधर भक्तेच्छोभात्यरूपाय परमात्मन्नमोऽस्तु ते नमो भगवते तुभ्यं वासुदेवाय विष्णवे पुरुषाय आदिबीजाय पूर्णबोधाय ते नमः पुरुषाय आदिबीजाय पूर्णबोधाय ते नमः.
I'm speaking with Dr. Nandita Krishna, who is the president of the C.P. Ramaswamy IR Foundation here in Chennai. She is a scholar of Indian art history, and her focus has been mainly on the study of Vishnu traditions. Vishnu is, of course, very important also in the Bhagavata Purana, and then there is the whole, what we may call, culture of the Bhagavata. And what I think will be interesting is to hear from you something about that development of what we may call a Bhagavata culture surrounding the text of the Bhagavata Purana.
The Bhagavata Purana appears in so many folk styles particularly. I mean, classical styles will already be very beautiful, and they are all painters with great training. But even simple villagers who do Madhubani painting, and so many, Cheryal is a kind of the forerunner to TV. It was very elaborately painted by the painters and the story told. Now, in all this, beauty was very important. It has to be a unity, there has to be a unity, and that has to create great pleasure. The first thing he looks for is a very beautiful smiling face. It must smile. He may be a Shaivite, a Vaishnavite, anything. But the face must be smiling and must be beautiful to the extent that the expression must be pleasing. And that is why you find that the Rakshasas, the demons, the Asuras, are always, mustachioed and pretty horrible looking fellows. So there's that contrast between good and evil. Because don't forget, the Bhagavata Purana, being an oral tradition, was probably just told by wandering minstrels, mothers to their children, minstrels to the common people, about good, the superiority of good over evil, and that you must attain that good. And to attain that goodness, you have to be good. So the emphasis on goodness is what I think is most important in the Bhagavata. Ahatti narahe muhatti le. That means your actions are reflected in your face. And if your actions are beautiful, your face is beautiful automatically.
In the Bhagavata, there are descriptions of nature as well. And that seems to come into the pictorial tradition.
To start with, in the Indian tradition, every deity is connected with a tree, an animal, and so on. Krishna is connected to the Kadamba tree. And in Krishna temples, you will always find, of course, the Tulsi in every home is Krishna's spouse, and the Kadamba tree in every temple. And he was somebody who lived in Vrindavan. And I don't know if you've been to Vrindavan. It is magical. Vrindavan is not just beautiful, it is magical. And the magic is the trees and the birds. And I'm sure in Krishna's days there would have been a lot more wildlife than there is today.
Oh, yes.
But it looks so beautiful, the atmosphere. It's like going to any beautiful place and getting carried away. So I think the beauty of the Vraj forests, there are 12 forests associated with the story of Krishna in the Bhagavata Purana. So the beauty of Vraj and the beauty of the trees, the plants, all that comes into the painting, and especially in the paintings of Orissa, where you have Jayadeva's Gita Govinda, which is a celebration of beauty itself. And there you find beautiful, not very realistic, but very beautiful, symbolically painted plants and leaves and flowers. I mean, the leaf may not be green, it may be red, it may be pink.
Yes.
That's okay, but it's a beautiful plant, and that's what matters.
Yeah. You mentioned Krishna is associated with the Kadamba tree. He's certainly also very much associated with cows.
Yes.
And the cows also get represented in painting, isn't it?
Yes, very much so. I did this book, I've done 2 books, one on sacred plants of India and another on sacred animals of India. And when I was researching it, the sanctity of the cow precedes the story of Krishna. But I'm quite convinced that the whole cult of the cow, the sacred cow, really developed with Krishna, because he tells the cowherds that don't worship Indra, worship the trees and the mountain Govardhana and the cows which give us milk. And he's very loving towards his cows. And I think that with the spread of the Krishna worship, the importance of the cow also develops in time. The Bhagavata lends itself a lot to the arts, to music, to dance. It speaks of bhakti as a marga, as a bhakti or devotion, as a path to moksha or liberation. Bhakti is total surrender, sharanagati, to a personal Lord. But then everybody has a chance of liberation, of going back to the Supreme Being in a very simple way, through bhakti, through music, through dance. You can just spend all your time singing bhajans to the Lord. And that is enough as bhakti. And that also does not require great scholarship or great knowledge or anything. So I think that made it so simple. So I think that accounts for the popularity of this movement, which did not require austerities and fasting and a lot of other things which are also very good and very good paths, but which may not be very easy to follow.
Since the beginning of the Oxford Centre for Hindu Studies, we thought it was very important to have a Bhagavata Purana project, because there has been no academic project to really study this. Individual scholars have done wonderful work, but really to get into the Bhagavata Purana from a multidisciplinary point of view, it's a massive work. But also it's had such a huge influence on Indian culture. In terms of art and music and dance and poetry and even architecture, philosophy, theology, economics, politics. Bollywood, how they represent religion, is to do with festivals and pujas and etc. So the Bhagavad has had a huge influence, but really we haven't looked into it to see, well, what's there? It's a profound literature, you know, in terms of its poetry and how the poetry has been constructed around philosophy and theology, and how it's inspired so many people to take that and then go into the world and do something with it. So it hasn't been part of the Brahminical traditions in the sense of confining it to one group. It's everyone has taken it and done something with it, every class of person. So it's wonderful like that, but so we really have to study it to understand India and to understand Indian culture and Indian thought in the modern world.
In my work on the Bhagavata Purana, I've been very particularly interested because there are different interpretive traditions. So I've been looking at what the Gaudiya Vaishnava tradition says about the Bhagavata Purana's portrayal of Krishna. Yes, he appeared, and they use the term appeared on earth, but that he has what I would say is an absolute form, an absolute body beyond the material world, beyond what the Advaitin tradition calls Brahman, the impersonal Brahman. That Krishna, it resides in a transcendent domain, the transcendent Vraja, where he revels eternally in his own blissful nature. So whether or not there's a world,
with his friends,
with his friends,
with the cows and so on.
Right, with his eternal associates who are, who the Gaudiyas would say, the cow maidens of Vraj, the cowherd friends of Krishna, the cows, his Nanda and Yashoda, his adoptive mother and father, that these are his eternal associates who were always with him in his transcendent world. And that at a certain time, in one cycle of creation, he chose to descend, and his eternal associates descended, and he unfolded his play on earth. So his eternal associates also appeared in human form, cow maidens, cow herds, and so on, and they engaged in the play on earth. And now the Bhagavata itself is supposed to be recording this beautiful play that from the Gaudiya perspective is not simply a manifest play happening in an earthly context, but is a transcendent, unmanifest play that's always going on, whether or not there's a material world. So Braj, the Hindi term for the Sanskrit Vraja of the scriptures, this is where Krishna unfolded his play. And so people go there now on pilgrimage to celebrate Krishna, to track his footprints at the various sites where his divine exploits are said to have taken place. And there they engage in a variety of other kinds of more popular practices, which I think have kept this text alive.
It seems to me that the Bhagavata, you mentioned before, there's a concern in the Vedic tradition, the power of mantra. And it seems the Bhagavata wants to preserve that with this idea that mantra has form, and that form is one of the forms of the divinity.
Yes. One chapter is on the Bhagavata itself as a text embodiment, as the embodiment of Krishna, both as a concrete book but also as sound. That the entire collection of sounds of the Bhagavata is like the subtle sounds out of which Krishna's form is made. Krishna's form at a certain transcendent level is vibrating as mantras, and that collection of mantras is the sound form of Krishna. And when the Bhagavata is recited, that he becomes present in his sound form, in his mantra murti in a certain way. So reciting the text is very important. Venerating the written text is very important. Reciting the names contained in the text is very important. So nama sankirtana, nama kirtana becomes important. The Bhagavata has...
What means kirtana?
Kirtana is singing the nama. Nama sankirtana, sankirtana is like the communal singing of the names of Krishna, particularly the names of Krishna, which are also contained in the Bhagavata. I also want to mention just briefly what the Bhagavata itself says about it has different origins, but one story about its origins, which is about Veda Vyasa. Vyasa is considered one of the greatest seers of the tradition, as you know. He's a Maharshi, he's a great rishi, a great seer. He is said to have divya chakshus, he has divine vision. He's one of the great sages. He had divided the one Veda, which was originally a singular text, 100,000 verses, into 4 sections, the 4 It became the 4 Samhitas. He composed the Mahabharata, the great epic. He composed the 17 other Puranas. He had attained Brahman. He was supposed to have realized Brahman, which was considered one of the highest realizations. But he wasn't fulfilled. He wasn't satisfied. And so, according to the narrative in the Bhagavata itself, it says, the celestial sage, Narada, came to him and said, you should sing the glories of Krishna. And he told him to go to his hermitage and to meditate. And so he went to his hermitage, his ashrama, and he sat and he collected his mind in samadhi, in the meditative state of samadhi. And there it says, purified by bhakti yoga, his mind purified by bhakti yoga, he saw the primordial Purusha.
The original person.
The primordial Purusha, right. And Purusha is understood here then and elaborated in the commentaries as Krishna. So what's interesting there is you have this idea that this great sage, one of the greatest of all sages, greatest of all seers, having realized so much, accomplished so much, he wasn't fulfilled until he meditated and saw the primordial Purusha in the form of Krishna. And then, according to the traditional understanding, the whole Bhagavata Purana is simply the unfoldment of the cognition, of visions of Vyasa. That the text is a record of his direct cognitions of Krishna, his divine leela or play beyond the material world, that he immersed himself in, swinging in the bliss of Krishna, and then he came forth and recorded what he'd seen in the form of the leelas in the Bhagavatam.
Yes, it's an
Drinking the nectar, huh?
But drink the nectar. Our conference on the Bhagavata Purana is now over, and I remain here to reflect. What is it so special about this text? And it seems there are basically 2 points that come up. One is it deals with an issue that we all have to deal with, and that is the fact that we all face death. The king in the beginning has been cursed to die in 7 days, and therefore he listens to the Bhagavata Purana. And as we also listen in, so to speak, to the teachings of the great sage Shuka, we become imbibed with the greater vision of a higher reality which can bring us beyond the limitations of our body. And the second, and certainly for many people, more important aspect is that the Bhagavata's attention is on Krishna. Shuka's teaching is that we should hear, that it is beneficial for us to hear about, to reflect on this wonderful divinity referred to as Bhagavan, the supreme personality of Godhead, in all his multifarious, charming, powerful ways, his surprising ways, his sometimes mischievous ways. The Bhagavata invites us into that world for the possibility of a transformation of ourselves.